Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bay by L.J. Ross, narrated by Clare Corbett.
The gods visit the sins of the fathers upon the children. Euripides. Prologue. Tyneside, mid-1990s. They came to take her father away in the early hours of Sophie's 4th birthday. She awoke to the sound of hard banging on the front door, followed by the angry shouts of police officers as they burst inside, splintering the wood from its hinges. Clutching her favourite stuffed toy, which happened to be a pink rabbit by the name of Flopsy, Sophie wriggled out of bed and crept towards the sliver of light shining beneath her bedroom door. Had Uncle Terry come to visit again? He wasn't her real uncle, but a friend of her father's, so she called him Uncle. He was very loud and smelled funny, like the carpet on the floor of the pub where they went for a carvery lunch on Sundays. But it wasn't Uncle Terry, because she couldn't hear anybody laughing at his silly jokes or telling him to get himself away home before he woke up the whole estate. Instead, she heard a stream of bad words she knew she wasn't supposed to repeat, followed by her mother's tearful cries. "What's all this about? What's going on?" She heard crashing and banging in the kitchen, and her legs began to shake. Paralysed by fear, but too frightened to stay still, she tiptoed onto the landing and peered through the stair rails to the hallway below. Beneath the garish light of her mother's crystal chandelier, she saw her parents held off to one side by 2 men in uniform, whose faces were as hard as the protective helmets they wore. Another officer joined them and spoke in undertones. "Found a big wad of cash in the kitchen, Gov." "What?" Her mother turned to her father in confusion. "There isn't any money in the house. Tell them, Mick." When he said nothing and continued to stare at a spot on the wall above her head, she began to cry. "My daughter's asleep upstairs," she implored them, scrubbing tears from her eyes. "Please? She'll be worried about all the noise." "They didn't tell us there was a kid," one of the officers muttered. "Better call child services." They turned back to the woman. "She'll be taken into care while you're both detained." "No!" The word burst from Sophie's mouth, and they looked up in surprise to see a pretty, dark-haired child watching them with big, terrified eyes from the landing above. "Sweetheart, don't worry," her mother started to say, but tears ran in rivulets down her face, clogging her throat. One of the officers held her mother back, while another started up the stairs, and, to Sophie's eyes, he was a monster dressed all in black, the stuff of nightmares. She began to scream. "You're scaring her! Please! Daddy! Daddy!" To her shame, a trickle crept down her leg, wetting her best little mermaid nightie. "Come on, pet. We'll get you a packet of crisps or something," the officer said, and plucked her from the floor where she cowered, a tiny ball of shaking skin and bone. As they carried her away from her home and family, the last thing Sophie remembered was not her mother's ravaged face, nor the balloons they'd put up in the living room for her to find later that morning alongside Barbie's Malibu dream house. It wasn't the sight of their neighbours watching from doorways and upstairs windows, nor the stench of body odour and urine drenching her young skin. It was her father's silence throughout the ordeal, and the knowledge that he never so much as looked at her before she was taken away by strangers. That she would never forget. 6 weeks later. "We can't go away without Daddy." Sophie's plaintive voice was almost her mother's undoing. "Please," she whispered, swiping away fresh tears. "Try to understand. Your daddy can't come with us. He's gone away." "Where?" Her mother didn't answer, but remained standing at the kitchen window, smoking the last of her packet of Marlboro Lights, while she waited for an unmarked police car to arrive. It hadn't taken long for word to spread. Mick Gallagher finally got his comeuppance, they said around the doors. Not before time. Everybody had known about Mick Gallagher. The real Mick Gallagher. Except his wife and child. It had taken 6 weeks before the courts deemed it safe for Sophie to be returned home to her mother, who'd been released without charge after long hours inside an interrogation room. But when Sophie leapt from the social worker's car, she found very little remained of the home she'd once known. The front of their house had been defaced by graffiti, spray-painted words she couldn't read but knew, somehow, were very bad. When the new makeshift front door swung open, it revealed her mother, a woman of 24, whose face was shadowed by all that had come to light in the intervening weeks, and whose eyes seemed decades older than before. They wore a distant, far-away expression she was too young to understand as being a byproduct of strong antidepressants, and her arms were thin and wiry as they held her in a tight embrace. Now, a few days later, her mother's eyes wore the same unfocused expression as they stared listlessly from the window. Sophie sat down on the linoleum and cradled Flopsy, who remained by her side as a constant companion. "Time to go," her mother said a few minutes later. "I don't want to." Kim Gallagher could barely process her own shock at finding out the extent of her husband's crimes, let alone form the words to explain it to a child of 4. "Do as you're told," she said softly. When the little girl began to cry again, big, rolling tears that made her hiccup, Kim found the strength to sit cross-legged on the floor beside her. "It's a beautiful place, where we're going," she said, and tried to sound excited. "It has a golden, sandy beach with lots of shells to collect, and there's ice cream shops and an arcade, I think. There's lots of boats, just like there is here. There'll be other children to play with, and you'll be starting school in September, so you'll make lots of nice new friends." Sophie heard the forced note of cheer and looked up into her mother's desperate eyes. "I thought it was just a holiday." Kim shook her head. "No, sweetheart. We're starting a new life. It'll be exciting." "Why can't I go to school here? Emily's going to St Joseph's." Kim thought of the words Emily's mother, her former friend, had thrown at her the previous week. "I'll tell you about it when you're older," she said. There came a loud bang on the door, which made Sophie jump, her eyes wide with remembered fear. Kim held out her arms so the little girl could crawl onto her lap, and decided to let them wait. "What's it called, the place we're going to?" Sophie said, after a moment's silence. "Cornwall," her mother replied. "A place called St Ives." "Will Daddy be able to find us there? I don't want him to get lost." Kim closed her eyes briefly, a single tear rolling down her cheek as she held Sophie tightly against her chest. "He's already lost," she whispered. Chapter 1. St Ives, Cornwall. 25 years later. The sky was ablaze. Detective Sergeant Sophie Keane thought this as she watched the sun set over the town of St Ives, leaving behind a dazzling canvas of pink and yellow as it prepared to fall off the edge of the world. The light in those parts had often been described as ethereal, something painters tried to capture time and again. But, like a half-remembered dream, it evaded even the most talented of artists. "Not bad, eh?" "I've seen worse," she agreed, and turned away from the window to greet her friend. Luke Malone was the owner of the beautiful new art gallery where they now stood, which had been built on the wharf overlooking the little harbour and the sea beyond. It boasted panoramic views spanning the town to one side, with its picturesque collection of old stone fishing cottages, all the way towards Godrevy Lighthouse on the other, half swathed in mist on the far horizon. "How's the opening going?" she asked him. Luke smiled across the open-plan space towards his wife, Gabrielle, who stood chatting with some of the more illustrious members of the local community, including the mayor and several town councillors. If he didn't know better, he'd have said she was bored witless, and made a mental note to thank her profusely and thoroughly as soon as they got home. With that pleasant thought circling his mind, He raised a hand to acknowledge his friend, Nick, who'd made the journey from Helford in support of his fiancée, Kate, whose illustrations formed part of the new exhibition of fresh talent that evening. The remaining guests were a mix of local journalists and long-standing patrons of the arts, as well as the family and friends of the artists, whose work hung in smart frames on the freshly painted walls.
"It's going well,"
he said.
"Kate was telling me she's been working on a project with a big children's author to illustrate a brand new series of adventure books, and Gabby can hardly wait to get her hands on some of them for the bookshop."
He smiled, thinking of his wife's passion for books, and of the life they'd built together in Carnance, a cove on the other side of the peninsula. "I'm glad things have turned out so well for Kate," Sophie said, thinking back to events the previous year. "She and Nick seem very happy together, and her son is cute as a button." There was a note in her voice he might have described it as wistful. Not envious, not jealous, merely a sound that conveyed a longing for something she didn't yet have. He wondered if she was aware of it herself. "I'm sorry I don't have any more news about the theft of that painting," Sophie said, steering the conversation back to business. "We're still investigating. Something's bound to turn up." The previous day, one of the star pieces of Luke's exhibition had been stolen on the eve of the gallery's opening night, apparently without any witnesses to the fact.
"What I can't understand is why they took that painting in particular," he muttered. "Of course, Moonlit Bay was very good. I wouldn't have included it in the catalogue otherwise, but Dean Mostend is hardly a well-known artist. I can't imagine they'd be able to shift it for very much on the black market."
He referred to one of the new artists he'd hoped to showcase, whose enormous oil painting of St Ives Bay in stormy weather was striking and bold, and sure to appeal to a collector with an eye for an appreciating commodity.
"It's a shame Dean didn't come along this evening, but he probably can't face seeing the blank space on the wall where his painting should have been,"
he added.
"There's been a lot of interest in it, and him, so we might have been able to reel in a few private commissions, if nothing else."
Sophie flicked through the catalogue she held in her hand to refresh her memory. Moonlit Bay was, as Luke had said, a striking piece of original art, depicting a group of fishermen unloading barrels from a boat late at night, their bodies illuminated by the light of a full moon, which shone an eerie white light across the rippling tide, which lashed against the boat's stern and crashed in foaming waves against the harbour wall. "It's hardly something that could fit in your back pocket," she said, noting its dimensions. "Somebody must have seen something, but it's been less than 24 hours. We're still continuing with door-to-door interviews, which could throw something up."
"Do you think it might have been kids?"
Luke asked, thinking of the small but persistent band of teens who like to joyride or lift the odd trinket here and there, usually to assuage boredom, or sell in exchange for drugs. Sophie frowned, then shook her head. "I wondered that myself. But whoever took the painting knew how to get around the alarm system," she pointed out. "This wasn't a smash-and-grab affair, which is something I'd expect from our usual merry band of idiots." He grinned at that, before his face fell back into serious lines.
"So you think we're looking for a professional?"
"Possibly," is all she would say. Luke noted the raised hand of a potential buyer.
"Let me know if you catch any leads in the coming days," he said. "I've got to go and schmooze someone into buying a piece of modernist art. In the meantime, try to enjoy yourself and have another glass of champagne. You're off duty, and hey, you never know. Some handsome stranger might wander in and sweep you off your feet with talk of Picasso and Barbara Hepworth."
Sophie laughed, shook her head, then turned back to the window to watch the sky turn from pink to mauve. Luke meant well, she was sure, but the last thing she needed was a man in her life, or anyone for that matter. She knew the emotional cost of loving and the inevitable heartbreak when they left or let you down. Giving her heart into another person's safekeeping wasn't a mistake she planned on making ever again. After a few minutes passed, she sensed a presence beside her. "Couldn't seal the deal?" she asked, and turned with a ready smile in place, expecting to find her friend had returned. Except, to her surprise, it was not Luke, but rather a man she'd never seen in her life before. Tall, black-haired, and possessed of a startling pair of blue eyes, her body responded immediately to the very embodiment of tall, dark, and handsome, and her first thought was to feel irrationally angry about it.
Not just yet,
he replied with a slow smile.
What?
The deal, he reminded her.
Whatever it is, I haven't sealed it yet.
To her horror, she felt a blush creep over her skin. He stepped closer to the window, an action which brought them shoulder to shoulder.
It's a pretty night, isn't it?
He said.
I think there's a storm brewing, though.
Sophie followed the direction of his gaze and saw only clear skies overhead and calm waters lapping against the shoreline. What makes you say that?
Just a feeling,
he said, and then leaned down so she felt the warmth of his breath beside her right ear.
That and the shipping forecast.
He straightened again and flashed a smile that was devastating. She said, and cast around for something more intelligent to say. Are you one of the artists being exhibited this evening? He shook his head.
Just an interested party,
he said, turning back to the view.
I remember this old building from a long time ago, before it was a gallery.
As a rule, she couldn't stand evasiveness, so that was an automatic strike against him, no matter how blue his eyes might have been. Oh? You used to live around here? He nodded.
In another lifetime,
he said, irritating her again.
I'm visiting the area for old time's sake. What about you? Are you one of the artists?
Maybe in another lifetime, she parroted, and then reached inside the pocket of her smart cream trousers to retrieve her warrant card. DS Sophie Keane, Devon and Cornwall Police. His blue eyes flicked over the card, then back up to her face.
Even better, he said. Now I know who to come to if I should stumble across a body.
Before she could formulate an appropriate response, he leaned in again to whisper a parting thought.
Next time, I hope to see you in your uniform, Detective Sergeant Keane.
He had the audacity to wink at her before strolling off into the crowd, his dark head mingling with others until he disappeared from sight. It was only after the flames of outrage had cooled to disdain that she realized he hadn't told her his name, nor anything else about him. Sophie had all manner of police resources at her disposal, but the fastest way to gather information in a town like St Ives was to seek out one of a small number of knowledgeable sources, any of whom could be relied upon to supply her with hot gossip about the people in their local community. Her first port of call was Jenna Pierce, her boss's wife. Mrs. Pierce, Sophie greeted her, with just a touch of deference. Sophie, dear, you know I've told you to call me Jenna, the other woman said, but they both knew that day would never come. There were ways of doing things in that part of the world, conventions that must be followed to keep the peace, which would be harder to maintain without the cooperation of women like Jenna Pierce and her circle of friends. Considering the cost-benefit ratio, Sophie had come to the sensible conclusion that it was worth biting her lip and sacrificing a modicum of self-respect for the benefit of the greater good. That didn't mean she enjoyed it. She gestured to the art on the walls around them. Have you seen anything you like? They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, until Sophie deemed it an appropriate moment to ask the question uppermost in her mind. Predictably, Jenna was already one step ahead. I bet you're wondering who that young man is, she said, in a stage whisper that turned heads and grated on Sophie's nerves. Now there's something I wouldn't mind taking home. She let out a bawdy laugh through lips coated in 3 shades of pink lipstick, which she licked in anticipation of sharing a fresh round of gossip. His name's Gabriel Rowe, and he's staying at Wharf House. You know, that lovely old house on the far side, before you get to the pier? Sophie nodded, for it was one of the most beautiful buildings in town, painted a delicate pastel pink, with trailing ivy over its old stone walls and other creepers that bloomed throughout the year. It had been built flush to the harbour, so that its outer wall merged with the harbour wall and afforded its owner direct access onto the sand, which became a larger beach when the tide went out. It was a lovely spot, and a perfect home for any family. "He's renting it?" she asked. "No," Jenna said, drawing out the word for dramatic effect. "Gabriel is the owner. I thought he'd sold the place years ago, but apparently not. His family used to rent it out for years after the accident." She paused, clucked her tongue, and waited. "What accident?" Sophie asked obligingly. "Well, you know. It was a terrible thing," Jenna rattled on. "His father, John, was a local doctor for years, but then, after Gabriel's mother passed away, cervical cancer, you know, poor soul, he went off the rails, started drinking." Jenna made a crass motion with her hand, as if the words were not enough for Sophie to understand their meaning, and her eyes strayed across the room to seek Gabriel out, concerned in case he should happen to see it. "All of this was before your time," Jenna was saying. "You came to live here. When was it, dear?" "I was 4, Sophie said, though she was quite sure Jenna remembered. "I'm 29 now." "Doesn't time just fly?" the woman exclaimed, and took a long glug from her champagne flute before continuing. "Well now, where was I? This must have happened a couple of years before you moved here, and Gabriel couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 at the time." Which made him 7 or 8 years older than herself, came the unbidden thought. "You were telling me about his father being the local doctor," she said. "Yes, of course I was. Well, John hit the bottle, and that can't have been easy for poor Gabriel. I used to see him pottering about on the sand by himself many a time. And of course we had him over for tea with Cameron quite often. They were in the same year at school, you know, and I was a great friend of his mother, Eleanor. God rest her." Jenna heaved a sigh, and her chest puffed out, straining the buttons on the tight satin blouse she wore. "It all came to a head late one night. John must have been steaming drunk because he left Gabriel asleep in his bed, wandered out of the house and along the pier. Well, you know how the tide can be. He fell, and the waves battered him against the rocks. Dreadful. Just dreadful. And to think, little Gabriel woke up the next morning to find himself all alone. The poor lamb." Sophie took a moment before speaking to ensure her voice remained steady and professional. But all she could see was a raven-haired little boy who'd lost his mother and then his father, all before his 11th birthday. To lose one parent was bad enough, but both. What happened to Gabriel after his father died? Did he have anyone to care for him? Unexpectedly, she caught sight of him, standing on the far side of the room, chatting with Nick and Kate. As if sensing her appraisal, he turned to look at her, blue eyes clashing with brown. And it was as though he'd reached across the room and touched her. She looked away, feeling unsettled. "His mother's sister took him in. They live in Truro," Jenna said. "I'd have thought they would have sold the house to help out with expenses. Well, there you have it. Gabriel's been gone for nearly 30 years, and nobody around here seems to know what he's been doing with himself in all that time. Though, by the looks of him, he's done well enough." There was a gleam in her eye that seemed to suggest she would be making it her business to find out more, and, had Sophie not been wary of conveying any personal feeling on the matter, she might have been moved to tell her to leave the poor man alone. Besides, digging into people's backgrounds was her job. Her eyes strayed back across the room, but this time he was nowhere in sight. Sophie told herself it was professional curiosity and not disappointment that caused the sinking feeling in her stomach. Later, when she was finally able to extricate herself from Jenna Pierce's fulsome company, Sophie made her farewells and stepped out into the balmy summer night, only to feel the first patter of rain fall against her upturned skin. As Gabriel had predicted, a storm was coming. Chapter 2. The storm raged all through the night, battering against the exposed walls of the town and howling like a drunken sailor through its cobbled streets. Rain lashed against window panes and rooftops, keeping awake all but the most long-standing residents of St Ives, who understood the deluge would pass just as quickly as it had come. Sophie might have counted herself amongst their number. And it was not the rain that kept her awake, but thoughts of a lonely little boy who was now a grown man, forced to leave all he'd known to begin a new life elsewhere. It was something she was uniquely qualified to understand. Snatched memories from long ago haunted her until dawn, rising to the surface of her mind like spectres, tormenting her with images she'd spent more than 20 years trying to forget. She chose not to remember the man who'd fathered her, nor of the times he'd been kind to her before they discovered the truth about the person he really was. She and her mother had begun a new life, with new names, and they'd never spoken the truth to anyone. Not then, not now, not ever. It was no great leap to understand why she'd chosen to enter the police service. It gave her a feeling of solace to know that her daily work went some way to balancing the scales of rights and wrongs in the world. She told herself that, for every person her father had ever hurt, she would prevent other families from suffering a similar fate by working hard each day to uphold law and order. It was a constant sweeping of the tide, she knew, but it gave her a sense of purpose and the comfort of knowing that she was nothing like him. Consequently, she was already wide awake and sipping her third coffee of the morning when her mobile phone began to shrill.
Keane? Sarge, it's Turner.
She rolled her eyes, thinking of the young police constable she was training up for the detective's pathway. He had a good heart and was eager to learn. But if she was in a less charitable frame of mind, she might have said he wasn't the brightest bulb in the box. Then again, raw intelligence wasn't everything. Instinct, hard work, a steady pair of hands, they were just as important, and sometimes more so in their line of work.
What's up, Alex? Sorry to call so early,
he said in a rush of words.
A call came through to the desk. Just now.
He trailed off, apparently waiting for some kind of response.
Well?
She demanded.
Spit it out before we both die of old age. It's, there's a body washed up on Porthgwydden Beach. A dog walker found it and called it straight in.
Sophie had thought he might have been calling to tell her that the missing painting had been found abandoned in a car park somewhere, or that a group of tourists had been involved in another brawl with the locals outside one of the pubs. Despite all the visitors who flocked to St Ives each year, they were lucky to have an extremely low body count, with most people dying through accidental or natural causes. So the fact that a body had turned up was the last thing she'd expected him to say. She let out the breath she'd been holding in her chest, and her voice was calm when she spoke.
Take another constable and get down to the scene to secure it. I'll call in forensics, but it will take them a while to get across, depending on how busy the roads are.
She paused to check the time on the large wooden clock she'd fixed to her kitchen wall. 6:15.
It's early yet, she said, but the weather's good, so people will be heading down to the beach soon. I want the body protected from the elements and prying eyes, so take the tent we keep in the basement at the station. You know the one I mean? That'll keep things private and protect the body from the worst of it until scenes of crime officers arrive.
Turner was nodding vigorously, until he remembered she couldn't see him through the telephone.
Yes, of course.
And Turner, don't go blabbermouthing to all and sundry. We'll be saying nothing until next of kin are informed. That includes speaking to your brother at the local paper. Is that understood?
Yes, Gov,
he said. I'll see you there. And Alex, bring a paper bag with you. His sergeant ended the call before PC Turner could ask why he should bring a paper bag with him. But the reason became painfully obvious the moment he joined her in the easternmost corner of Porthgwydden Beach a short time later, where a sheltered arc of powdery sand met the rocks. The beach itself was one of the smallest in St Ives, nestled between the main harbour and the slightly larger Porthmeal Beach, in the lee of an outcrop of headland known as the Island. The land on either side blocked out most of the prevailing winds, making it a perfect spot for families with young children who were more interested in building sandcastles than surfboarding, and who could be easily sustained by a trip to the nearby beach cafe. However, thoughts of sausage rolls and pasties were far from Turner's mind as he trundled across the sand towards Sophie, dressed in white polypropylene coveralls, while she stood as
Sample complete. Ready to continue?